Good morning. Thank you for joining today's Research Radar webinar, Low Density, High Impact, Research Topics for Rural Mobility, hosted by the Minnesota Department of Transportation and the Minnesota Local Road Research Board. My name is Stephanie Tofty. We're excited to have our presenters, Greg Lindsay, John Brunkhorst, Michael Siska, and Sydney Tate with us today. Today's webinar is part of the Research Radar series, sponsored by the MnDOT Office of Research and Innovation and the Local Road Research Board. Each month, we highlight research projects focused on a common theme. Before we get started, I'll read the Tennyson warning. This session will be recorded for those who cannot attend. If you have enabled your camera during the session, the recording may include your image, which is private data under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. You are not required to allow MnDOT to use your image, and there are no consequences for declining to do so. To opt out of the recording, simply turn off your camera. MnDOT's Office of Research and Innovation manages more than 185 research projects in progress, ranging from local initiatives to pooled fund projects with other states, comprising both basic and applied research. We're here to help transportation practitioners determine whether new research is needed or if existing studies may solve your needs, recommend the best research methodology for your project, access local and national funding sources, and manage your project from start to finish. The Local Road Research Board is a city and county-run organization that sponsors research and educational initiatives that address local transportation needs. You can stay up to date with our research by following us online and subscribing to our newsletters. We will send you website and subscription links and a follow-up email following the webinar. We funded 28 new academic research projects for 2026. To see the full list of new projects, scan the QR code on the screen. If you have subject matter experience on any of these projects and are interested in serving on the technical advisory panel, please reach out to our office by emailing research.dot@state.mn.us. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Presenting Understanding Pedestrian Travel Behavior and Safety in Rural Settings is Greg Lindsay. Greg is Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota's Hubert Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He specializes in micro-mobility traffic monitoring and modeling. He was principal investigator for 2 MnDOT projects on pedestrian risk on reservations in Minnesota, and currently is co-investigator for a MnDOT project with the Fond du Lac, Mille Lacs, Red Lake, and White Earth reservations. I hope I pronounced those correctly. Presenting gravel road and shoulder maintenance is John Brunkhorst, Regional Business Development Manager with Stonebrook Engineering Incorporated, and Michael Siska, Assistant Public Works Director for Maintenance and Operations with Nicollet County Public Works. John is a licensed professional engineer in Minnesota with more than 25 years of experience in transportation and public works. As a longtime county engineer and public works director, he led operations, managed multidisciplinary teams, and oversaw a wide range of infrastructure initiatives at McLeod County. Recognized with multiple statewide and national awards, John now brings his public sector leadership and technical expertise to business development and research efforts at Stonebrook Engineering. Michael is the Assistant Public Works Director for Maintenance and Operations, serving Nicollet County since 2013. He is responsible for overseeing the annual planning, budgeting, scheduling, coordination, and execution of maintenance activities for both roads and parks. Prior to working at Nicollet County, he obtained a bachelor's degree in construction management and gained 14 years of experience in the commercial construction sector. And lastly, presenting research synthesis, design and impacts of rural roundabouts is Sydney Tate, Transportation Planning and Research Manager, High Street Consulting Group. Sydney is a traffic engineer with a background in transportation planning, research, safety analysis, and traffic operations. She is a project manager for High Street Consulting Group, where she regularly leads regional and statewide research and planning efforts. She also supports national research as she has contributed to 6 national cooperative highway research program studies within the last 2 years. Sydney is most passionate about making transportation more equitable and sustainable for all users. She has both a master's and bachelor of science degrees in civil engineering and is a licensed professional engineer for the states of Florida and Louisiana. We have time reserved after all 3 presenters have presented for Q&A. But for now, I will hand the baton on to Greg.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you see my slides okay?
Looks great.
And can you hear me well?
Affirmative, yes.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm pleased to be here. My name is Greg. I'm a professor emeritus, as said, from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and I've had the good fortune to work on issues of pedestrian risk on 7 reservations in Minnesota over the last decade.
Looks like you got muted, Greg.
How about now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes,
I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there. I'd like to thank these organizations for the work that's occurred over the past decade, because without their steadfast commitment to trying to make reservation roads safer for pedestrians, none of this would have happened. There's the Advocacy Council on Tribal Transportation that represents the 11 enrolled federal tribes in Minnesota, the 7 Anishinaabe bands in Minnesota, Bois Forte, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, Mille Lacs, Leech Lake, Red Lake Nation, and White Earth Nation. The Minnesota Transportation, which includes the Central Office, Office of Tribal Affairs, OTAT, Transit and Active Travel, as well as district offices. County transportation departments were frequently involved, and at the U of M, there was the Traffic Observatory, the Humphrey School, and the College of Engineering. I'm going to begin with a simple question, and I think good research often does, and that is, over the past decade, the last 10 years, how did ACT, the 7 Anishinaabe bands, MnDOT, county transportation departments, and the U of M collaborate to produce evidence that resulted in funding of countermeasures on 6 reservations and safety studies on the 7th? And I'm going to give you the answer now so you know sort of where I'm going. And our insights from this collectively, and I'm going to speak again for myself, and nobody in those organizations bears responsibility for what I'll say, but mission and values and policies matter. The evidence that we produce is essential for changing practice. A lot of times we're going to find information out that is complex. We're going to find that risks, pedestrian risks, are relative to context, but they're real for the people who live with them. We're going to think about different ways we can address equity, because it's important, as well as efficiency. We're going to talk about collaborative engagement to transportation projects, and it's our belief that it's critical. We're going to talk about the importance of engineering with people and not for them. We're going to try to illustrate that subjective value-based decisions are inevitable in transportation planning and engineering products. And we're going to try to show that risk can be reduced but not eliminated. So in other words, we begin with I think, a simple question and then end up with the complex results. Now, the work I'm going to try to cover has gone on for the past decade. In about 2015, MnDOT began talking about strategies to help address concerns about pedestrian risk on reservations, and they began by approaching ACT, the Tribal Advocacy Council, about collaboration. That resulted in a research project that lasted through 2019. It's called Phase 1, and that involved primarily documenting pedestrian activity and road crossings on reservations. That led to a Phase 2 that expanded to 3 additional reservations, plus evaluation of countermeasures that were implemented because of Phase 1. And we've just begun in 2025 a Phase 3 project in which we're revisiting 4 reservations to address other types of problems that haven't been done. So the work I'm going to cover is now evolving over a decade, and we see changes that we're happy with. I think one thing to begin with is that organizational missions matter. And these projects never would have been initiated nor conducted if MnDOT, I think the administrators there, beginning with the commissioner on down, didn't take their mission seriously. And so if you go to a webpage of MnDOT, you'll find that MnDOT says, we understand that some of our past decisions denied Black and Indigenous communities, as well as with people with disabilities, the full participation of transportation benefits. And they're committed to transportation equity, which, in their words, requires ensuring underserved communities, including Indigenous populations, share in the power of decision-making. And so I think the 3 projects that I'm going to provide an overview illustrate commitment to that mission and fulfill. And that's, I think, important. If we keep organizational missions in mind, to provide safe, efficient, environmentally sound transportation, we'll be more likely to stay on track. Now, this is the unique context of traffic safety on reservations. There's a culture of walking and low car ownership, partly because of poverty. There are large roadway networks, often not walking friendly. These roads have high speed, big trucks, limited lighting, vegetation often up to the roadway. There are low population densities, high rates of fatalities. Vacation and pass-through traffic sometimes is unaware that they're passing through residential areas. And this, I think, is important too. MnDOT has not always had the best relationship with the tribes as they acknowledge. And we experienced that when we began work there. The way MnDOT has tried to address that is with a commitment to tribal nations that establish the government to government with the sovereign Anishinaabe nations. And they've worked through that with consultation, coordination, and cooperation. So this permeates how each of these 3 projects have been done. And I'll try to explain it this way. MnDOT's approach has been to ask the individual tribes or bands if they would like to collaborate. They've asked the partners where pedestrian risk exists. They've asked collaborators if it's appropriate, if they want to engage U of M, and we've been providing the support on the activities. They've asked about monitoring designs to document risk. They've asked for participation in data interpretation. They've asked collaborators about countermeasures to address risk. And then they've supported those collaborators in funding countermeasures. And so it's a process of engaged research to try to address concerns in a way that addresses the needs of the populations they're serving. These are the 7 bands where we've worked over the last decade. Those circled in black were Phase 1. They were Boys Fort, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, and Mille Lacs Reservation. Phase 2 are those in red, Red Lake, White Earth, and Leech Lake. Right now with Phase 3, we're doing work in Red Lake, White Earth, Mille Lacs, and Fond du Lac. What I'm going to do now is share with you an overview and then some pictures that are I'll call them mini case studies for the 15 minutes that we have here. Phase 1 involved observation, videotaping pedestrian crossings at 10 sites on 4 reservations. The volumes ranged from only 4 pedestrians to 136 per day. Pedestrian driver interactions during crossings ranged from 9 to 50%. The pedestrian yield rates were in some places relatively low, 50%, but most of them were around 95, 96%. The investments in outcome from the first 4, Phase 1 involved countermeasures of funded and implemented on 3 reservations at 5 locations and another safety study. Phase 2 was funded and implemented with more pedestrian monitoring, looking at crossings. And then it also involved, which is, I think, relatively unique and a tribute to the commitment of of both the nations and MnDOT learning about the results is evaluation of what was going on where phase one countermeasures had been implemented. A spin-off benefit outcome was that we've done additional work with graduate students doing additional pedestrian studies on reservations. When we look at this, the important thing from this slide is just the numbers that I've circled on the table with the red ellipse there. And in total, what we've done is work at 29 different locations and implement more than a dozen countermeasures over the last couple of years. So I'm going to show these case studies that illustrate the type of things that we've done. I'll take two from phase one because we've also done post implementation evaluation, and then a second Red Lake where we're going back to address other outstanding pedestrian risk concerns. The Grand Portage Reservation, it's up in the extreme northeast. It butts up against Canada. Route 61 cuts through the reservation. It turns out that there was a Route 61 road resurfacing project. We did our initial work slightly before that. The tribal elders had received concerns from tribal members about crossings at two locations, one of them to the trading post and post office, and the other a crossing from a county / reservation road that went to schools. We deployed video cameras. We counted pedestrians. We observed traffic and pedestrians for about 2 weeks in each location. You see the total numbers of pedestrians observed, 150 to 220, about 10 to 14 people per day. That varied somewhat. And about 1 in 5 of those crossings involved a pedestrian interacting with a vehicle. That involved either the vehicle slowing, the pedestrian stopping, or some sort of observable change in the behavior trajectory of the individuals. Following those results, the district engineers met with tribal officials and U of M people from the traffic observatory, and we looked at what are strategies for trying to address these concerns. The result was marked crosswalks at 2 locations, gated post-crossing signs, new pavement markings at both those crosswalks, and more importantly, I think, sidewalks and formalized these informal crossings that we saw. There were blinker lights indicating pedestrian bikes for the next mile on 61, and there was some additional work done on the segment. This shows you a place where improvements were put in. What we have is a situation you can see left here where my cursor is. There's a subdivision. This is actually to the west because the road's going pretty much north-south there. At this point, pedestrians were crossing here, walking down this hill to get to the trading post. And often, excuse me for that, there were children, adolescents going by themselves. And so what MnDOT did was work with the tribes to identify strategies during recrossing to try to formalize this crossing. So there were steps built here, an ADA accessible ramp here. The crossing was formalized, lighting was put in, signs were put in, and this the rail was put in to try to guide here. These results show crossings that occurred the year after the countermeasures were put in, and you can see virtually everybody, the majority, 80% of the people are now going straight across using the access points, but you still have people that are not. So when we talk about risk remain, there are still individuals who choose not to cross at the crossing route. The next part where we did is working at Mill Lacs. In this particular case, it's a similar context. We find that a highway bisects the reservation, and what we see are people crossing there. Here, you can see there's 2 crossings, and I'll show you those next. At this location, people are crossing from a residential area here to get to a market and the casino, a principal place of employment. And you can see here an informal desire line. This is a crossing spot through a break in a frontage road fence. And then here is a formalized crossing with a stoplight over 169. It's four-lane access. It turns out at the informal crossing, 136 people per day, half-mile south at the formal crossing, 4 people per day. And so the question was, how do you look at this? The tribal engineers had identified prior with no data, a hawk signal, a bridge, or a new stoplight. It ended up, these are examples the pedestrians are crossing. A gentleman on the midway, a woman pushing a baby carriage, 3 kids, another bike. This is the type of activity that was going informally along this desire line. The result was identification funding from TAP funding for construction of a hawk signal. You can see we had the monitoring results in 2017, funding in 2019, design in 2020, construction in 2021, and we went back to evaluate in 2022. What we did in the evaluation is we tracked the number of people crossing, where they stopped, the number who landed on the median, the number that went across. This is the timing of the hawk light. You have it's a cycle, takes 51 seconds. There's activation, flashing yellow, solid red, and then flashing red after people cross. And the nature of use this slide to illustrate the nature of the risk. We put in a fix to try to reduce risk to pedestrians. Some pedestrians may not activate. Some may cross before the walk sign goes on. Drivers may not stop or yield. And the same thing, drivers may not stop or yield through the continuation of the flashing light. So what we tried to do in the evaluation was look at how we treated risk where people crossing informally with risks that were retained after operation of a hawk signal. We found still about 120 people per day crossing there. Crossings were great late in the afternoon, say at the end of the day, or with people going for a night shift. We saw similar rates of interaction with drivers, about half the pedestrians. Here's where we begin to see the difficulties of trying to do technical fixes to pedestrian patterns. We had low rates of activation, overall just 28%. When drivers were present, there was just 37%. We measured waiting time till activation, 12 seconds with it, 4 seconds without. So the fact that we're asking pedestrians to wait influences their decision about whether to activate. What we saw is we had 95% of pedestrians yielding at the informal crossing. That dropped to about half. We had frequent driver driver violations of red lights. Many of these, however, were technical in the sense that they would go after the pedestrian had crossed in front of them. And so this was 5 years after the initial monitoring was done. We then evaluated further options. They include engineering, education, enforcement, research, and this MnDOT is continuing to monitor. The last one I'll mention is up in Red Lake in Reservation in Redby. It's a town of a community of about 300 or 400 people. You can see there's no formal crossing, a small market on one side of the street, and the post office and another one-stop gas station on the other side. And what we saw was before any sort of intervention is people stopping, leaving their car running, oftentimes going across the street to the post office and coming back. So one of the questions the tribe had was how might we formalize this area to try to reduce risk for people driving through on Route 1. In this case, the project ended with no money for design, so we put to work a graduate student. This was a separate collaboration with the university in Red Lake that evolved from the MnDOT project. We had a graduates team. They interviewed, they sent out mail questionnaires to tribal members through Tribal Works Public Works Department and asked them about ideas for crossing. They had 3 or 4 conceptual designs. They asked people to evaluate. This is the synthesis design that emerged from the survey of Red Lake Nation residents. And so the idea here again was ask the people who are crossing what preferences they'd like to see. And they see native vegetation and a number of other factors that you can read about if you want to look at the report. So you have these insights. Daily crossing volumes are low relatively, but they are not low to the people who live them. At the first meeting in Grand Portage, we had a tribal council member say, we are more than just small numbers. And so these are some of the challenges that we face when we're trying to deal with these sites. Risk is real. We have pedestrians emerging out of forests along roadways for people who are making pass through and may not expect to see them there. But we do think we can address the concerns of tribal residents. As we tried to illustrate, collaboration is essential. If we are opportunistic, we can integrate some countermeasures into other planned road opportunities. And overall, we think this begins to address some of the longstanding equity concerns that exist. Where we are now is phase 3 in Fond du Lac, Middle Lacs, Red Lake, and White Earth. We're observing pedestrian crossings. A particular problem that exists along all these reservations are individuals walking along road shoulders, with no pedestrian infrastructure for miles distance. We now have a new technology that's going to combine motion detected cameras with AI processing to try to help us identify that. So that's a new application that we're just now installing those cameras. So I'll go back to the answer to our sort of a complex answer to our simple question. How can transportation planning reduce pedestrian risk in rural areas? I think so. If we pay attention to our mission to serve all, we build evidence. We acknowledge the reality of those risks. Even if the numbers of people who may be affected are small, we think there are ways to address those. Engagement with collaborators is critical to the process. We need to think about, one of the options was trying to, in Middle Lacs, close that fence, but people had cut holes in it previously. So we have to recognize that people are going to make decisions to go places, and we have to address those issues. Many of the decisions we've made are subjective and value laden, but they're all we want an evidence base for those. And last, risk can be reduced but not eliminated. I'd be happy to answer questions or discussion at any time. So thank you all for being here today. Stephanie?
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for sharing this collaborative approach. Up next, and again, we'll do Q&A at the end, so hold your questions, please. Next, we have John Brunkhorst and Michael Suska with Gravel Road and Shoulder Maintenance.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. For those that aren't familiar with the Local Road Research Board, one wing of it is the RIC, which is the Research Implementation Committee. And Stonebrick is fortunate to be one of the contractors that works on those type of projects. And this one happened to be the 18th project of 2025. And look forward to walking through that today with you guys. Again, myself along with Mike from Nicollet County. So why the project? How it ended up, about half the gravel roads in Minnesota are gravel, I should say. Half of the road system are gravel. Counties that shrink in budgets, they got small maintenance crews, costs go up and so forth. So part of what the RIC does is an outreach effort every year, and they go out to cities and counties, and in this case, they went to a District 7 county engineer meeting, and I think Mike was in attendance a few years back at the meeting, and this came up as an idea, and as it circulates through the RIC process, it rose to the top, and Stonebrick is very fortunate to be able to work on it. It was a fun project. It turned out really well. So, the main focus was how can we help agencies maintain their gravel roads with, of course, the shrinking resources we have. And so why Nicollet County? Mike's done a great job at Nicollet over the years of documenting a successful process, putting together notes and ideas, and just keeping everything together. He's looked at a lot of resources: federal highway, LTAPs, North Dakota DOT, South Dakota DOT, MnDOT, federal highway, National Association of County Engineer documents. Mike's looked at everything. And so what we put together was, we call it the Nicollet County Method. And it's kind of Mike's brainchild of everything they do. And the report ended up in a one-spot shop, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And of course, Mike's been the champion for this, and even going around statewide a few years back, Mike presented at the County Engineers Annual Conference, and it was very well received. So what do we try to do? Again, document the Nicollet County method, quantify their material savings. We put out a pretty robust survey of local agencies with various questions on it, from motor grader attachments and how are you doing some reclamation of shoulders, and a whole host of questions and answers in there. It turned out pretty well. And then, of course, we synthesized Nicollet's best practices and then create implementation resources, which again they'll come up later in the slide. Following that, kind of the scope of it, like I kind of mentioned, but basically the review that Nicollet County method, which is document, was a big piece of it, right? What's Nicollet doing? What are they doing well? How are they doing it? We wanted to document that. Of course, the gravel specifications, they're not using the CAN specification out of the MnDOT specs. He looks at a combination of gravel out there and what's working with their current gravel resources. A lot of the rural counties out there, the good gravel sources are dwindling, diminishing. So counties are forced to think out of the box a little bit and work in reclamation material or look at different gravel sources and do some blending. And Mike's done a lot of that. And there were some good specs that are part of this research that came out of it in the report. Shoulder reclamation, they've saved a lot of money over the years looking at ways to reclaim the shoulder, things like that. And then looking at the best practices, like I mentioned, they went with not just Minnesota guidance, but looked around with what's available nationally. Again, Federal Highway, LTAPs, a whole host of different studies out there. And there's previous LRB reports that are out there that are done, and Nicollet County considered those as well. And then we took all those and compared them and synthesized them in this final report coming up. Again, that survey I talked about, for 87 counties in Minnesota, having a response rate of 53 is very good, certainly well over half. And so we got some good responses on that. We asked about the maintenance practice, like I said, equipment questions. What are people running for equipment? What are they doing for different treatments and things like that? And then some different questions on challenges and opportunities. And that survey was, again, part of that final report. So then the deliverables, of course, we had draft reports, the TL review. So with RIC projects and LRB projects, there's always a champion for those. That's the technical liaison. In this case, of course, it was Mike. And then the TAP review, which is the technical advisory panel. So the TAP got together in this one probably 3-4 times, reviewing different portions of the status of the project and the report, and gave input on everything. And then, of course, the final report, like I mentioned, we put together an 8-minute video that's on the website as well, available, and then a one-pager. So then a summary of what we delivered. Again, part of that final report is a bunch of the technical resources. There's hyperlinks to the various specifications from South Dakota DOT, North Dakota DOT, MnDOT. There's links to presentations from local technical advisory programs from North Dakota, Minnesota, and other resources Mike has used over the years. They're all documented in that final report. We did put together a 2-page flyer that kind of summarizes a high level of the important stuff for the gravel maintenance. And then the big one, of course, is this training video. It was an 8-minute YouTube video that's on, available on that website as well. And there's QR codes at the end. Otherwise, I will put a link in the chat as well. And then again, part of the final report was that robust statewide survey. And so with that, I think that's a good segue. I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about his Nicollet County method.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. I'll just kind of start our little journey here. Back in 2013, when I was hired at Nicollet County, I would ask everybody any kind of details pertaining to gravel roads, and nobody knew anything. Even the operators, we had some that were almost blading for 30 years. They had no idea when it came to actually understanding gravel specs, understanding gravel road specs itself, like how wide roads are supposed to be, how deep the gravel is supposed to be. So it's kind of a forgotten art. That's why the original presentation is back to the basics. We go through all those core standards and relearn all of them. And how do we implement the new technology that's out there to better our road system? So here at Nicollet County, we do have 86 miles of gravel roads. We have 220 hard top roads, concrete and bituminous, how can we actually use the equipment from our gravel roads for our gravel shoulders. And I'll kind of get into that a little later. And again, in 2013, I started documenting with pictures, with notes, talking to constituents, talking to blade operators, working hand in hand with our engineer here, Seth Greenwood. He's fantastic. And moving forward from there, just creating those little, every time I found something, I would put it down in a certain note that I had when it came to standards. Ken Scorseth, I have to hand it to the guy and his team. They put together the Gravel Road Construction and Maintenance Guidebook. That is the main book we go to for all of our gravel, but it is a thick book, and I make some cliff notes for that for everybody around here, the townships and local counties, so they don't have to take 10 years to understand the book, because again, there is a lot of great information, but it's a lot. We can go to the next slide. Our final results, once we had our spreadsheets from earlier, we do have some good accountants here. We were able to take our numbers prior to when I started in 2013, and we could see that we were having a huge reduction in our manual labor, also with our gravel material itself. The book, again, Ken actually has a chapter in there that explains, once you understand these principles, I think in his book, he has up to 70% reduction. So hopefully we get there, but we're on the right path. So $150,000 a year with our gravel roads. That's roughly what we save every year. For example, before I started, they were using sometimes up to 19,000 tons of gravel, and now we're down to that 4,000 to 6,000 tons of gravel. So that alone has just, not only time has it saved, but we're also doing other things that maintenance needs to do out there. Like one of my main blade operators, he runs the excavator more now than he does with a motor grader. So we're getting to those ditches that haven't been cleaned since the 60s, and we're getting to those hills and tree trimming, all those other items that were really lacking through the years. The shoulder reclaiming with the hardtop roads, we'll see some pictures. All of these things are in that video. It's a great video that John and his team put together. 8 minutes. It says a lot right in that video. But again, smaller crews, better roads. Our hardtop shoulders, you could see they were starting to get inverted because they just kept adding gravel instead of someone going out there with a smart level and actually checking the slope. We want that 4%. 4% is our main number when it comes to gravel road crown, and it comes to our shoulders on our hardtops. So 4 pillars here. Not one answer is the correct answer. It's a combination of everything. So specs, we were able to work with some neighboring counties, go through this manual again from Ken Scorseth. From there, Seth took it. He modified our spec in 2016. Huge compliment, because in 2018, then MnDOT actually added portion of our spec into their spec with the plasticity requirements. Fun fact, plasticity was a requirement back in the 40s, and then it was all the way, I think, until 68, they took it out. So plasticity is, we use it for clay. So a lot of times when you're testing gravel itself, people think that plasticity is the 200. That's actually, plasticity is testing the 200. It's a whole other test you have to do once you get the sieve done. So that was a learning curve too. Surface gravel itself, and then what is base gravel? We had to go through those gravel specifications. MnDOT does a great job calling that out. Can you go back one more? Yes, better blading practices. We'll get through some of those, creating standards for our blade operators. We have 3 blades. We have main blade operators, and we have 4 backup blade operators. So we don't have to worry about if somebody goes on an extended vacation. And then seasonal scheduling. What do we do in the spring? What do we do in the summer and the fall? And then in the winter, how do we prep these roads? We are strong eggs, so they are used heavy. And then again, our shoulder reclaiming. Okay. Best practice with gravel roads. Again, increase the binder content. We were from 6 to 10. Now we're up to 12. We even will let it go to 13.5. Great binder. We test our gravels. South Dakota has a really good spec when it comes to actually testing our clays. I should correct myself there, but find as many clays as you can, test it, find the best one you can use in your gravel, and then get that plasticity index, not just from the clay, but also in your gravel mix itself. And when you combine those two, you get a really nice road mix that'll create a nice hard pan. It's imperative that you have a packer, a walk and roll behind your blade, because you do want to have that compaction is key when you have that higher plasticity in there with the higher binder content. That kind of avoids the smeary road, they call it. So once you have all that in play, you get the better material retention with less gravel loss, and then longer time between maintenance cycles. We used to have to blade our roads probably every week or two. We have some roads we haven't touched now almost over 2 years. So very, very good improvements. Number two, smarter blading. Again here, these are these key standards with operators. 3 to 5, these are all in the manual. 3 to 5 miles an hour, 30 to 45 moldboard angle. They talk about 2 pass versus 6 pass. That comes into with if you have wet conditions, which is the 3/10 rainfall or more. If you don't have those conditions, then we call it our dry blading technique, which is we go out and we take care of the spot blading. There is an actual manual out there from Wisconsin that's called, I think, the Hazer manual. Talks about how to utilize that. You go out and you hit your hills, curves, intersections, anything that has those rumble strips during those dry blade times. And then maintain that 4% crown. We're fortunate enough here that the previous engineer was able to actually rebuild a lot of our gravel roads. So we actually have plans for our gravel roads, and majority of them are 3.5 to 4%. And again, compaction is key. You have to have that compactor out behind those blades. Create that hard pan / crust. We came up, one thing we did come up internally is the rule of threes, that 3/10 of rain, that decides if you're going to do a wet blade or a dry blade. 3 blade cycles, that is what it takes when you add new gravel or you pull in shoulders into a gravel road. You pull that sod in, you break it up. We do have a tiller. We were fortunate enough to get a tiller last year from LTAP Opera Fund. It's a pulverizer that goes behind a tractor. It speeds this process up, but if you don't have one, it's going to take 3 blade cycles to actually get it kind of leveled out. And then it takes 3, moving on, it takes 3 dry days to bake that material. So if you go out in your blade and you're going to do a wet blade or with all that new material on that road, make sure you're watching the weather for 3 days, because if it rains, it can create a mess out there. So we call that the baking time that we need on these gravel roads to create and form that hard pan crust. Shoulder reclaiming, here's a couple pictures. That was the first reclaimer we did get, 2013. We do use it on our gravel roads now, but all of our blades actually have one right on the front of them, and then they have the walk and roller. But we were able to use the original tools from the gravel over to our hardtop roads. Again, we're trying to get that 4%. We save roughly 6,000 tons of gravel annually just on this shoulder reclaiming. We do try to hit every road we can in the spring. We used to do it in the fall. That left that large lip all summer. I know that engineers don't like to see that. It is prone to accidents out there when people are correcting their cars when they hit that. So we hit it right away in the spring. Great results with that. I do see other agencies doing it. MnDOT does a great job with theirs. And then we can cover so many more miles. The guys that are actually doing the hardtop roads are my secondary blade operators. So they can kind of see it. They kind of have the know-how when they're out on the gravel roads. So it just made sense for them to do the hardtops. And we went from 9 to 3 people. So key takeaways. It's extremely important to document all your existing conditions, document all the questions you have from constituents, from staff, so that you can address those questions. Again, document all of them. I think I'm up to 50 questions. That's a great file in itself. Use the right gravel spec for your area. Gravel is different in different areas. We have glacial till. Looks like the majority of the state has glacial till, but there are some spots in southeastern Minnesota that have limestone. So just figure out what works the best for you and use it the best you can. Focus on your timing and your moisture, that 3/10. It's all timing. And then train your operators consistently with those standards. It's just, I have one sheet I printed off to all the new guys. They get all those cheat sheets, and I can take the last couple guys, within 5 years, they've been blading like they've bladed for the last 30 years. It's quite interesting, and it's rewarding to see these young guys really take to it and enjoy the job. They're not scared of it anymore. And then reclaim and reuse the material whenever possible. Again, if you're not pulling shoulders in the spring and you don't know how wide your roads are, you're in for a rude awakening when you pull the tape measure and you find out your road was originally designed at a 24-foot top and it's at 32. That's not uncommon actually to see that. If nobody wanted to pull the shoulders for the last 30, 40 years, because that's when the phone rings. But again, having great standards, working as a team, having great equipment for using that, having great material, all those things working together, you can really have a nice gravel road program. And I do want to thank everybody with LRRB, and John himself, he's a pro at this, so it was easy to work with him and his team. They did a phenomenal job, and obviously our engineer Seth is fantastic. So
that's a good segue. Thanks, Mike. So again, final deliverables. I'll put the link in the chat too to the main Local Road Research Board page for this. But you get the phones out. You can grab the QR codes for the three main documents that are on there. Again, the survey is part of that report that's at the end. And it looks like we got about 74 people on the call here, and hopefully there's a lot of county engineers or county engineer staff. If you got some young county engineers out there, or even some maintenance folks, I highly encourage you to grab these reports and watch that 8-minute video. It's really well done, and Mike's getting to be the gravel road guru in Minnesota. So it turned out really well, and we thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Gravel road guru. I like the sound of that. The Nicollet County method. Stay tuned for more on that. Thank you all. And then next up is Sydney Tate presenting research synthesis, design, and impacts of rural roundabouts.
Thanks, Stephanie. Everybody able to see my screen? Just making sure.
Yep, we see it.
All right, great. Well, thank you guys all for having me here today. I'm Sydney Tate. I'm from High Street Consulting Group, and I'm really excited to chat with you guys today a little bit about this recent research synthesis our team at High Street completed on behalf of MnDOT that's focused on the design and impacts of rural roundabouts. Within the past few years, the number of roundabouts that MnDOT has constructed has been steadily increasing, and this is especially true in rural areas or more remote settings. So one thing the department really wanted to have more information on is how to approach, considering and accommodating non-motorized users at these intersections. So they let us know that internally, they were working on developing some guidance on how to decide whether to implement different types of pedestrian or bicyclist facilities at these types of intersections. So that was the overall motivation and background of the study, where we came in and we were tasked with synthesizing what other agencies are doing around the nation related to this topic and kind of documenting what has and hasn't worked for them. So as part of the study, we were focused on all users, of course, focusing on how different design elements can impact speed, compliance, and cost. But we really focused our efforts on non-motorized users and how different treatments can impact their safety, accessibility, and mobility. I wanted to acknowledge our project team. So I was looking through, I don't know if I see any MnDOT advisory panel members on the call, but definitely wanted to give them acknowledgement. Derek Lohr was our main PM on this project, our technical liaison, and Bria Carlson was our coordinator, helping the entire project run smoothly, scheduling the TAP meetings, and really helping us out in that administrative role. And we also had a great panel on the MnDOT side who provided great feedback and really helped the project be successful. And on the consultant side at High Street, I see a couple of my colleagues on the call. I just wanted to thank them as well for their contributions to making this project work. So one of the first questions we had when taking on this project was, how are we going to define rural? It kind of depends who you talk to and the setting you're in or the region you're in. Everybody kind of has a different take. It really depends on the context. So we, did our literature review, and we also spoke with the panel and landed on, for the contents of this study, rural is defined as the different types of contexts that align with MnDOT's context categories that are already in their facility design guide. So you can see these pictures here. If it's like a natural, rural crossroad, or rural context category, that was our realm of rural for this study. And then also we made sure to notate what we meant by non-motorized users, travelers that rely on human power for movement, but mainly pedestrians and bicyclists in this context. So a few things I'll touch on today are our main research tasks for the study. We started with a literature review, doing some desktop research. We created a survey and distributed it to practitioners across the nation. If you're from a different DOT, you may have gotten an email from me asking you to complete our survey. You may have completed our survey. Thank you if you did. Really appreciate all the feedback we got, and we'll talk about that. And we also spoke with some people. So we did the survey, did the desktop research. We wanted to talk with people and get those nuances of how they're doing things and what works for them. And then I'll summarize the main takeaways and our conclusions. So for our literature review, we started with a broad sweep of national guidance related to roundabouts in general, rural roundabouts, non-motorized users at roundabouts, anything we could find. And we found that NCHRP 1043 is the main latest and greatest roundabout guidance nationally. Most DOTs reference this guide in their own state guidance, so it's definitely widely accepted. Within the guide, there's all types of exhibits and recommendations on different types of treatments for bikes and peds, but it really emphasizes context, as you can see in this exhibit here, focusing on the location. What is the point of the project? Where are you located? What are the different nuances of that location? And making sure to take a performance-based approach and iterating your design as needed to make sure that you're developing performance measures to address the context for the area you're in. Outside of looking at roundabout guidance in general, we also focused on rural settings and guidance there. So we found that, there's lots of literature on roundabouts and lots of literature on rural intersections and lots of literature on designing for non-motorized users. So we're trying to find that sweet spot of where all those topics intersect. So we kind of approached it looking at them independently and then also trying to find literature where they intersected. So these are just some guidance, specific to rural settings. So reducing speeds at approaches, typically you're seeing higher speeds on those rural roadways because you have less intersection density. Intersections are more spaced out typically. Extending the splitter islands as you're approaching the circulatory roadway of the roundabout is common in rural settings. Having more advanced warning devices because there's fewer intersections typically, that's commonly done. Adding lighting at the crossings and approaches to make sure that the driver is aware there is an intersection coming and that there might be, non-motorized users attempting to cross, and then making sure adequate right-of-way is available. As far as focusing on national guidance on non-motorized users at roundabouts, you can see a great quote there about there's a distinction between accommodating users and designing for them. So that was noted in that NCHRP guide. General takeaways, prioritizing visibility, conflict reduction are the main things you want to hit on. If the design is to have a shared lane approach where you're encouraging bicyclists to take the lane and travel with the vehicles in the lane, you don't have a separate bicycle facility, trying to terminate that bike lane about 50 to 200 feet upstream of the roundabout itself. And there was an interesting note in the national guidance on an option to omit marked crosswalks if you have a very low volume rural area that's not estimated to have any seasonal or recreational demand. So that was an interesting note we saw in the literature as well. So after we did our national sweep in our literature review, we did a more focused perspective on state DOTs. So we did a sweep of high level review of different state DOTs, and we picked 8 to dive into more deeply. So you can see the state DOT manuals, design manuals, or roundabout guidance that we focused on in this research. We selected these states based on guidance from our advisory panel, takeaways we found in our literature review. If we saw some states had a more advanced approach to things, if they were more innovative, or had guidance already. And then also we tried to target some Midwest states to kind of get that peer state point of view from MnDOT. So I'll hit on a few takeaways from our state guidance review. So when it comes to having defined explicit guidance for rural roundabouts, we found that Georgia, Ohio, and Wisconsin had rural roundabout guidance spelled out in their design manuals. But looking more broadly, all of the state manuals that we assessed had considerations for high-speed approaches that were applicable to rural roundabouts. So seeing that distinction between calling out rural roundabouts specifically versus having a more general recommendations for high-speed approaches. We looked into some guidance for bike facilities, and this is specific to single lane roundabouts. Wherever there is a multi-lane roundabout, it's always advised to have a separate bicycle facility. But if there's a single lane roundabout or it's a shared lane, some states will choose to encourage bicyclists to take the lane and travel with, intermixing with the vehicles. And so we saw that in Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Maryland, Texas, and Wisconsin. While in Indiana and Ohio, they typically encourage their designers to incorporate separate facilities. So even if it's a single lane roundabout, having that separate bike facility. So we saw that distinction. And then when it comes to pedestrian facilities, it really varied. We went through each manual and they all hit different points of, using judgment, considering context. All of those were acknowledged when it comes to pedestrian facilities at rural roundabouts. So the next thing we did was we developed a survey to send out to practitioners. We wanted to develop a sample to get those deeper insights that we couldn't get from the literature review. So to do that, we looked at practitioners through the AASHTO committee database, as well as ITE committees. And in our literature, any names or agencies that kind of rose to the top as consistent names we kept seeing in the literature, we reached out to practitioners from those agencies as well. So we looked at the Traffic Engineering Committee, different design subcommittees with AASHTO, and we also looked at the Maintenance Committee and sent out the survey to those practitioners as well, because one of the key questions MnDOT had was, what are other DOTs doing when it comes to maintaining non-motorized user facilities, especially in those winter months? Are they snow plowing crosswalks and sidewalks at those rural locations? How are they handling that? So we wanted to try to get that specific perspective as well from maintenance team members. And then from the ITE world, we looked at their Roundabout Committee and their Bike Ped Committee and Complete Streets Council and sent out the survey to representatives from those as well. As far as who responded to our survey, we were really encouraged that we received responses from half the nation. So 25 states were represented in our survey. And that resulted in 38 total responses. So sometimes we had multiple practitioners from the same state respond. It may have been their traffic engineer and their roadway designer specialist both responded, that type of thing. Of the respondents, we had 87% that were DOT staff, and then the other 13% were either consultants or researchers. Within the respondents, the type of roles they had were typically traffic engineers and roadway designers. Again, we did have a few maintenance staff as well and planners respond, but that was the main groupings we saw. I'm presenting here our main takeaways from the survey. I'll dive a little deeper into each one individually, but just to give you an overview of the different types of questions we asked and how people responded. So we asked about agencies' approach. How do you decide or what to do? When do you have a formal policy? Kind of what is your approach to? Do you always implement bike ped facilities? Do you never do it? We kind of got at that point. And we saw that most agencies really use context. That's the main word you hear me keep saying over and over again. That's what we kept seeing. And a lot of them just use engineering judgment as the primary factor in their approach. When it comes to types of treatments that they do implement, crosswalks were number one, refuge islands, curb ramp treatments were also pretty popular in the results. We also asked about, what factors contribute to the decision you make on whether you do or do not implement these type of facilities. Most practitioners talked about examining the surrounding land use of the area, existing demands, and then also future volumes as well. And we also asked about challenges, kind of what inhibits implementing these type of facilities, what would kind of be a deterrent, And we saw that the number one results were construction funding, and then just the assumption that they're not going to be utilized. So a little bit more about the agency approach. It was implemented on a case-by-case basis at most states. They regularly have their own guidance. So we asked, do you have your own guidance that you use? Do you refer to national guidance or peer states? And we saw that most of the respondents say that their states refer to their own internal guidance, but they supplement it with external resources as well. And those resources would come from NCHRP, AASHTO, Federal Highway, or their neighbor states that they typically would reference. For the most common treatments, I already told you that crosswalks and refuge islands, curb ramps ranked at the top, but lighting, shared use paths, and sidewalks were also pretty popular as well, according to the results. It was interesting that most of the respondents did not favor the separated bike lanes, or they weren't implemented as frequently. Not that they don't favor it, but they did not implement them as frequently. And we saw that most agencies tend to encourage their bicyclists to take the lane and intermix with vehicles at their rural roundabouts. For the decision-making factors, talked about land use and volumes, but crash history and whether the corridor or the location was already a part of a priority walking destination was another factor that some practitioners referenced. So some states have independent efforts where they're already prioritizing corridors or general regions for walking and biking. So if that was already done independently and that road or area was already on that list, then they're more likely to provide a facility there. Practitioners have a preference to tie into existing connections or planned networks, which makes sense. You don't want to have a sidewalk to nowhere. So if there's already a plan to have a sidewalk or already one in place, you tended to have a sidewalk implemented. There were a few agencies that either always implemented bike ped facilities or never did, but that was pretty rare. Most people took it case by case. And then maintenance costs and resource demands. So another question outside of just whether they perform maintenance was, do other agencies consider maintenance costs as a factor on whether they decide to implement them? And we saw that according to the survey that was deemed as kind of least important when ranking, from least to most important across different states. And then finally, the biggest hurdles to implementation. So insufficient right-of-way was named as another frequent challenge in addition to the funding constraints and assumed underutilization. And then we saw that even though people tended to rank maintenance, resource demands, and costs as least important, 25% of them ranked them as a challenge. So that was interesting. And we also saw that resistance from the community was a hurdle that was typically had to be overcome as well. So after we did the survey, we also talked to people through some interviews. So we decided to select a few agencies primarily based on survey findings. A few of the agencies noted that they're already thinking about this topic. They're developing their own guidance for rural roundabouts. So we decided we definitely want to engage them. And a few agencies were referenced by other states as they use their guidance. So that also was a factor of whether we decided to interview them as well. So we interviewed representatives from Georgia DOT, Illinois DOT to kind of get a peer state perspective. Oregon DOT, they were in the process of developing their own guidance. New York State, we talked to a design specialist who had decades of experience and a lot of feedback to give us and insights as well. And we also talked to a consultant so we could get a multi-state perspective as well. The main takeaways from the interviews, some agencies were already in the process of updating their guidance. And again, context kept coming up. Context was the main factor. And how to understand context, you can look at counts, if agencies have complete street guidance, if they use their travel demand models to get kind of a context of their area, growth rates, crash history, all of that was important. One interesting thing we found in the interviews is a lot of times agencies will kind of future-proof their intersection. So even if they don't install a sidewalk right away or a crosswalk right away, they will go ahead and implement curb cuts. So in the future, they can go back and put in a crosswalk, stripe it in, even if the context changes or the area demands it more. As far as maintenance, we saw that the maintenance ownership was kind of something that was a big factor in the design. So states really vary on how they handle maintenance. Some require their local agencies to perform maintenance. Some require a property owner to perform maintenance, and some state DOTs do the maintenance. So it really varied state to state. But if a local or a citizen was required to maintain the infrastructure of the facility, then they were likely to ask the DOT to omit it. We saw that none of the DOTs that we engaged do snow plowing at rural roundabouts in their areas in winter months. And one interesting note was that the splitter islands are a challenge for some of the maintenance teams, is navigating the geometry of them. Some takeaways about local partners. We saw that collaborating early is really key to making sure that these facilities can get implemented when they are desirable. So just engaging the local agencies early on in the process, especially talking about maintenance responsibilities, was a big factor that was discussed. Agencies that already have complete street guidance or intersection control evaluation, ICE guidance or policies, if they already have those systems in place, they were more likely to get buy-in on these type of facilities at rural roundabouts, is what we heard as well. And construction costs were a factor, not all the time, but definitely were a factor for some agencies, and the funding source can kind of influence what's designed. If it's coming from HSIP funding, it's probably more likely to have additional funds to be able to fund the additional PED facilities. If it's coming from another funding source, maybe it doesn't have that flexibility.
Hey, Sydney, Stephanie here. Can we conclude your talk on one of the slides? Where I just want to preserve enough Q&A time for everybody. I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. I'm just getting to the end anyway. In conclusion, these are the contexts. Context is the main factor. Clear communication, and then just some resources that MnDOT already had. So thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sydney. That was great. So we have a couple minutes left for questions. Let me turn on the mics for folks if you'd like to ask your question out loud. Otherwise, I can keep an eye on the chat. Any questions for our presenters today? Well, I've prepared questions in case this happened. Greg, I have a question. What did the active pedestrian observation look like? Did you face similar obstacles to the pedestrians you observed, and did you observe yourselves?
We had a standard protocol for observing pedestrians at each of the locations. They involved posting video cameras from which we could observe pedestrian approaches and vehicles. Those then we went through those were reduced manually to document numbers of pedestrians along with vehicles. And we did, those were typically done by undergraduate students. So we did inter and rater reliability tests to make sure our students were interpreting things the same way. We did some of those ourselves, of course. And then a particular question, when people had questions about how to interpret a particular activity, they call in one of the co-investigators to try to resolve that particular analysis. The way that we looked at interactions was involved looking at changes in trajectory of either the pedestrians or vehicles. And for more complex analyses, like the evaluation of the Hawk signal, we had a couple-hour meeting with the local tribal engineers, the district engineers, to identify the measures they wanted us to document. And then we used the same approach. We used video, systematic reduction of the video along with timing analyses to look at how long it was taking people to get across, that type of thing.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I overlooked the Q&A tab. The first question that came through is from Mike. Generally speaking, how do snow clearance activities differ for gravel roads versus hardtop roadways? And is blading after snow clearance compulsory?
That's a great question. Our hard tops are our priority roads. We don't always hit our gravel roads. We kind of have a 2-inch rule of snow. And then we actually, on our front one-way plows, they roll back with a hydraulic so that we're not scraping the gravel itself.
Very cool. Thank you, Mike.
Yep.
And another one for Mike. Have you shared this with townships? They could really benefit from reduced cost and staffing.
Yes, we've partnered with LTAP this year, and it's called I think it's called the shop. It's just a shop class, gravel shop class. And what we do there, it was actually just over here in St. Peter the first time this last April. We used to do it locally, and then LTAP reached out, and we do have some counties all the way from like Cook County. They come, Mille Lacs County's been here, and we go through it. LTAP would like to have a standard PowerPoint that other agencies could go throughout the state, and then they could have their own kind of open discussion with townships as well once they kind of all work together in their region. So there is a big goal for this. So, great question.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Doug had a question, but Sydney answered it in the presentation. So, Sydney, I have a question for you. If there aren't any questions in the chat, okay. I know that for visually impaired folks, roundabouts can be challenging in the era of electronic vehicles and how quiet they are. Being that rural roundabouts might have greater speeds leading up to the roundabout, is the audible cue that a vehicle is coming, did that come up at all with the user survey or practitioner survey about something to think about?
Yeah, that's a great question. It didn't come up specifically, but we did have a lot of conversations about the PROAG guidance. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but there's like there's federal guidance on, the expanded guidance on how to make intersections more accessible. And there are, recommendations for audible cues at intersections and things of that regard. So like audible pedestrian signals, things like that, even outside of roundabouts. But it didn't come up specifically, but we did hear that when agencies do put in pedestrian features that they, have to be fully ADA compliant. Like they don't just, put a sidewalk in and a crosswalk in, just call it a day. They make sure, that they're following all those, requirements and typical best practices when they do implement them. That's a great question. Something to think about for sure.
Thank you.
So this is Jenny, if I could kind of add to that. So I work for State Services for the Blind, and I am an orientation mobility specialist. So I work with folks all over the state in rural and urban areas and teaching those skills to cross, your residential areas or highways or more urban areas as well. And to do that non-visually. So I've been thinking throughout all of this, first of all, a thank you for what everyone, does to make, traveling more accessible. It is true that anytime an audible feature or a tactile feature can be included, it is super helpful, especially when there is a hill or a curve involved. Because you can't hear that traffic or know what it's going to do until it's right in front of you. And I think Hawk signals do have that option, if I understand correctly, of having an audible component, but I don't think RRFBs do. And it seems that RRFBs are often, if there's any kind of control, are often placed around roundabouts. And that is tricky because you don't know if it's working, you don't know what, if you can't see it, you don't know what's really happening. So anytime those audible features are there, I know my clients really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jennifer. Looks like Cameron has a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether you folks have been doing any consulting with the international community, since especially the Europeans and the Asians have been dealing with roundabouts for decades now. And it seems like they would have some things that they're doing, because people are people are people. You know, there's nothing that's particularly American about, having any sort of impairment or, driving or whatever.
Yeah, just to speak to that quickly, we did look into international resources in our literature review, honing in some on Australian practices specifically. But yes, anytime we do a literature review, we try to make it broad. I just presented on national and state, but we had some international references as well. It's a great point.
Thank you.
Okay, we're a little over time. So if you have questions, there is a way to reach out to the presenters to ask those questions following today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for the next webinars in our series. We will follow up with you via email with a link to a recording of today's presentation, information about Research Radar webinars, and links to the resources we've shared today. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for attending.